My guest today is Professor Sarah Berry. She's the Professor of Nutritional Sciences at King's College London and the Chief Scientist at Zoe. Sarah and I delve into a wide array of topics, including what precision nutrition is, how genetics affect metabolism, the mechanistic processes that happen when we eat, what exactly atherosclerosis is, arguments around the carnivore diet, Apo B levels and LDL cholesterol, if it's okay to have high LDL if your Apo B levels are low, whether or not calories are the most important factor in weight loss, time-restricted feeding, if all calories are created equal, the thermogenic effect of food, Sarah's thoughts on pro-protein culture, why there is so much disparity on protein levels and nutrition, and what Sarah would eat if she only had 10 foods to live off. I feel very fortunate to have had the opportunity to interview Professor Berry. As podcasters and content creators, we do like to hypothesise and speculate. Let's be honest, on stuff we don't really know that much about. Sarah clearly takes her responsibilities very seriously and sticks well within her lane of expertise. Today's episode is a little shorter than usual, but there is definitely plenty in here for us all to take away. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Professor Sarah Berry. Hey everyone, just a quickie before we get into the conversation. The podcast is always going to be free, so I'm never going to ask you to pay for anything, but if you could do me the kindness of subscribing and maybe leaving a review, that would mean the absolute world to me. Thank you and enjoy the episode. Sarah, tell me what's brought you to where you are today and the work that you do.
So I would say it's my passion just for following what I enjoy at the time. I didn't start out as, someone at school with this great desire for nutrition science or to be an academic or even to be a scientist. I was a rather reluctant scientist. I actually didn't like science when I was at school. But I'm someone that's always thought that, you'll do your best if you take the door that opens at the right time, that you find the most interesting path. And so, I've kind of got to where I am just because I've been having loads of fun and I love doing the science that I get to do. And I've had some amazing opportunities and it's led to me to the position where I'm Professor of Nutritional Sciences at King's College London. I'm the Chief Scientist at Zoe. And I was brought up where my dad used to say, if you find a job that you enjoy, you never work a day in your life. So actually, I feel like I just get to do my hobby every single day and feel very fortunate to be in the position I'm in.
That's wonderful. And let's talk a bit about Zoe. So, when did you join there? And talk to me about what Zoe's mission is and how you interplay those things.
Yeah, so Zoe is a science and nutrition company. Its mission is to improve the health of millions. And we want to achieve this by utilising the best science possible and bringing it to the millions and enabling people to make the smartest food choices and lifestyle choices to improve their health. I became part of Zoe before it was even Zoe. This was 7 years ago when Zoe was still an idea. So there were 3 founders. And at the point in time where they were thinking about what they could do in terms of the science to be able to build a personalized nutrition product that will enable people to make the smartest food choices. I had various chats with them because there was a significant overlap with the work that I was doing as an academic at King's College London. And I kind of informally joined the team and I've been there ever since. And, it was a team of 4 people 7 years ago, and we now employ about 400 people across a whole load of different areas, from marketing to product to operations to science. So it's been a really exciting journey. I've been an academic now for 25 years at King's College London, and to work at Zoe that has such a phenomenal pace, a phenomenal resources, and also a kind of different outlook to how we do traditional science in academia has been incredibly exciting. We have this gold mine of data, which is just phenomenal for scientists like me to be able to work on, but also to be able to implement the science that we're doing into a product that is helping people improve their health. It's great.
That's amazing. So, and what about what do you think is the biggest challenge for Zoe as a company as you move forward?
So I think it's the same challenges that face us as a population, the same challenges that face us as nutritionists, as healthcare practitioners, etc., etc. And the problem that we have is the food landscape that surrounds us. We have a food landscape that I think is pitted against us, where we have an enormous amount of heavily processed, unhealthy food, where accessibility to whole plant based foods is harder than the accessibility to the cheap, or rather to the unhealthy, ultra processed food. And so I think battling against that is hard for everyone, and it's one of the biggest challenges that we have at Zoe, is enabling people to make the healthiest food choices against this awful food landscape that we live in.
And what is precise nutrition?
So we call it personalized nutrition. Some people call it precision nutrition. And the underlying premise behind it is the delivery of dietary advice that's personalized to an individual. So historically, when we thought about personalized or precision nutrition, we thought about the delivery of dietary advice personalized according to someone's biology. So by that, I mean their DNA or their age or their sex or some blood marker or their glucose response, etc. But actually, what we are really starting to see from our own research at Zoe is that we need to evolve our understanding of personalized nutrition. And that's what we're doing with our work at Zoe and how we deliver the advice as well. And we need to encompass people's uniqueness in terms of their biology, so the kind of factors that I've talked about. But we also need to consider people's uniqueness in terms of how they live their lives. So how much they've slept, what time of day they're eating, how stressed they are, how much physical activity they do, for example. All of these factors we know also impact how our body responds to food. And then you have as well other lifestyle factors. And then also you need to consider people's own personal preferences. What are their dietary preferences? Why do they make the dietary choices that they make? And I think that, there is this focus on choosing the right foods for your biology, or choosing the right foods, to maximize and optimize your health. But actually, ultimately, we need to choose the right foods that fit with us in terms of how we live our lives, in terms of what we like. And if we don't enjoy the food, then there's no point eating it. So we've kind of expanded our view of personalized nutrition, that it's personalized to your biology, which is where the precision nutrition originally came from, but also personalized according to how you're eating your food, how you're living your life, and what your preferences are as well.
And I suppose when you look at those variables such as lifestyle and genetics, there's, I don't know, an infinite amount of different routes that you could go down and different approaches. But if you took, let's say you controlled for lifestyle or just made that a non-variable, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think where we're going with this is, in addition to lifestyle, so let's remove lifestyle from thinking about it, how important are some of these other factors like genetics? So this is something we've been measuring. We have been running this huge program of research. It's called the Zoe Predict program of research. This is the world's largest nutrition program of research. And what we've been doing as part of this, in hundreds of thousands of people, we're collecting lots of data about the individual. We're collecting data about their genetics for some of them, their microbiome for all of them, their glucose responses, their blood lipid responses. We collect lots of information about their health history. We collect information from an app, about what they're eating, when they're eating, how they're feeling, etc. So we have this vast amount of data. And from this vast amount of data, we can tease apart what is most important, so what matters for whom. So this is where we can see that, yes, lifestyle is important, but this is where we can also see what's the relative contribution of genetics versus age versus sex versus, other factors. And we've published on this a few years ago in Nature Medicine, where we actually tried to quantify, depending on different outcomes, how much each of these factors contributed to shape someone's response. Now, when we talk about responses, there's hundreds of different responses you can have after eating food or in the long term after food. But we chose to focus on postprandial glucose responses, which is basically the increase in circulating blood glucose, or also known as blood sugar, after having a high carbohydrate meal. We also focused on post-meal inflammation and also post-meal blood fat responses. And when we looked at those, what we found was that genetics played a small role. It depended on the outcome. So it contributed to about 40% of the variability that we had in the postprandial glucose response, but only about 5% in the postprandial triglyceride response. So it was variable. So what we could see is that, yes, genetics plays a role, but depending on what response to food you're looking at, it varies differently. We also saw that microbiome played quite a big role, so that the microbiome was explaining a lot of the variability. And when I talk about variability, what I mean, Jason, is that we looked at how variable people's responses were. So we gave everyone exactly the same meal. We told everyone, fast overnight, coming in the morning, you're going to have exactly the same meal. It's going to be high in fat, high in carbohydrate. Let's look at how your body responds to that food. Let's look at the circulating glucose, triglycerides, inflammation, and lots of other measures. And what we saw was that despite controlling for everyone in the previous 24 hours, despite controlling exactly what food we were giving people, there was a 20-fold difference in how people responded. So some people had huge increases in either inflammation or glucose, etc. And some people had very small increases. And so when we saw this huge variability, that's when we did the deep dive into looking at what's explaining that variability. And that's the kind of data that I've just mentioned, where genetics explains some of it, microbiome explains a large proportion. And then you've got other factors that come into play. Some of it is the how we eat, which we haven't traditionally looked at as nutritional scientists. And then the others are things like, what's your fasting levels of lipids or glucose? What's your family history? Those sorts of factors.
So interesting. So I suppose the take home from that is that overall lifestyle is probably the bigger lever. Would that be fair to say?
I think that overall, what would be fair to say is that genetics is not the sole determining factor. It's not the main determining factor. And I think, I was a child growing up in the 70s at the era of genetic discovery. In the 80s, I remember hearing, lots of times, oh, well, it's all in your genes. If you're overweight, it's in your genes. If you're this, it's in your genes. If you're going to get heart disease, it's in your genes. Yes, there is some genetic contribution, but actually we're not a hostage of our genes. And I think that that's a really powerful thing to understand, because it means that actually there is a lot we can do. And I think that many people are becoming very aware of this, that it isn't all in our genes, but there are still a lot of people that are like, oh, there's nothing I can do. Well, actually what our research shows, and this is in line with other people researching in the area, that genetics plays some contribution, but actually the majority is modifiable. It's modifiable depending on what you're eating and on your lifestyle. So there's a lot we can do about it.
Yeah, and I feel like there's enough self-limiting beliefs out there, so we don't need to add that one into the mix. So, yeah, that's really insightful. So, before we get into like a little bit more detail about your research, I wondered if you could give us like a bit of a 1,000-foot view, world whistle-stop tour of what happens when we eat.
Wow. Okay, so when we eat food, we typically eat food, not nutrients. So we eat food that contains a mixture of macronutrients. So the main ones we think about are the fiber, the protein, the fat, the carbohydrate. The food also contains lots of micronutrients. So typically we think of vitamins and minerals, and it also contains lots of what we call bioactives. So these are chemicals like polyphenols, for example. So we now know that on average, food contains around 72,000 different chemicals. So firstly, I would say when we think about what happens when we eat food, we firstly need to recognize that food isn't just simply made up of those macros, that fat, that protein, that fiber, that carbohydrate, it's actually a complex mix of about 72,000 different chemicals that all interact with each other to modulate each other's health effect. That food is also encapsulated within a complex structure, which we call the food matrix. And we know that the food matrix also impacts to modulate how that food impacts our health. And we can always pick up on this later if you want, because I've done a lot of research around food matrix. So we're eating food, we're not eating nutrients, and we're eating food that has a particular matrix or structure. When we eat that food, what happens is in the short term, you have very short-term changes in circulating metabolites or downstream metabolites in our blood. So what happens is when the carbohydrate that's contained in the meal causes a short-term increase in circulating blood glucose. We call this postprandial glycemia. It peaks around 30 minutes after consuming the meal, returns to baseline around 2 hours. The fat in the meal causes an increase in circulating blood triglycerides. We call this postprandial lipemia, and that peaks around 4 hours after eating the meal, returns to baseline around 8 hours. So what happens is that in the pattern that we typically consume foods, where we have multiple snacks, multiple main meals, you actually spend most of your day in this state of what we call metabolic flux, where you're having these peaks and troughs in blood glucose, you're having these continually elevated peaks in circulating triglycerides. So apart from the few hours just before you wake up in the morning, depending on what time you have your last meal of the day, you actually spend most of your day in what we call this postprandial state. And prandial is just Latin for eating, so it's like post-eating state. And this is important because what we now know is most of the long-term impacts that food have on us are actually due to what happens in this postprandial state. Not all, but the majority. And so what we know is this postprandial state, where we have these increases in glucose, in insulin, in changes in gut peptides related to hunger and satiety, these changes in triglycerides also initiate a cascade of downstream health effects. So they initiate, for example, increases in inflammation, in oxidative stress, in clotting, etc. Now that's normal, that's a normal physiological response, and our bodies are very clever, so we're well able to handle that. But the problem is the kind of foods that we're eating now are causing quite excessive changes in these circulating metabolites that we believe over time are actually, our body cannot consistently handle, and then over time become harmful for us. And that's by having the kinds of foods that are causing really excessive peaks in some of these metabolites.
And is one of the biggest ones like damage to the cell wall? Atherosclerosis, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Yeah, so atherosclerosis, in a kind of really simply put, is I often refer to as like furring of the arteries. So it's where you get a build up in the arterial wall of all different kind of fatty style structures and molecules, which over time thin the artery, and also this build-up can also become loose, and if it becomes loose, it can also block the artery and lead to a heart attack. We know that diet is one of the key risk factors for atherosclerosis, so for this furring of the arteries. And we know that there are certain dietary risk factors that have a particularly strong impact on atherosclerosis. So what we know is that atherosclerosis is determined primarily by an increase in circulating LDL cholesterol, which is our bad cholesterol, and that if it's also in a very inflammatory style environment, that makes it even worse and more likely to stick to the artery walls. And so any dietary, any foods or dietary components that increase our bad cholesterol or cause excessive inflammation are going to increase our risk of atherosclerosis. So, for example, we know that most saturated fat has quite a potent effect on increasing our bad cholesterol. We know that polyunsaturated fat has a potent effect on reducing our LDL cholesterol. So despite a lot of the nonsense that's out there by many people saying seed oils are toxic because they contain lots of PUFA, or saturated fats are actually fine for us, the evidence, in my opinion, is consistent and irrefutable that increasing your polyunsaturated fatty acids reduces your risk of atherosclerosis, increasing your saturated fatty acid intake increases your risk of atherosclerosis. They're the two key dietary risk factors. There are other risk factors that come into play where food might cause, excessive inflammation, that sort of thing as well. But they're the two key ones that we need to be mindful of.
Mm. You can probably see where I'm going with this. So, what about the whole the Apo B thing, the carnivore diet? That it doesn't matter if you've got high LDL. I mean, if you go far enough down that rabbit hole, there's some people that say Apo B doesn't matter, and that it's high glucose, which is the issue. Could you myth bust and kind of like break that down into what's sensible about some of what's going on there, what's nonsense?
Yeah, okay. So there is a lot of what I call nutri-nonsense out there. So a lot of nonsense related to the evidence around nutrition. A lot of it comes from people who have huge social media platforms, but people who don't necessarily understand interpretation of evidence or some of the kind of underlying mechanisms. A lot of the time, some of the myths that are actually circulate around cholesterol or seed oils, etc., are based on cherry-picked evidence or mechanistic evidence that might play out in a petri dish or might play out in a mouse, but actually in humans don't play out. And that's what we have to be really, really careful when we're looking at the evidence and looking at evidence that people are presenting to us on these platforms. Has this been shown in humans? What has it been shown consistently in humans? And has it been shown in what we call randomized controlled trials, which is like the gold standard of research? So when it comes to Apo B, apolipoprotein B is a particle that basically sticks to these very specialized parcels, as we call them, that carry cholesterol and triglycerides around our body. And Apo B comes from two main sources. It comes from the fat that is produced by the liver, so the triglycerides, which is the form in which the fat is released by the liver, and it also comes from the intestine, from the fat that we're actually eating. So when we eat any fat, what happens is it comes into our blood, it comes into our gastrointestinal tract, it crosses the cell layer into our blood, and it's packaged into this specialized lipoprotein particle, this specialized parcel, which we call a chylomicron, and it has an Apo B attached to it. When our liver produces fat, then it's also packaged into a particle. In this case, it's called VLDL, and an Apo B particle attaches to it. What we know is that the VLDL production, so the fat production by the liver, is partly driven by how much glucose we're eating. So there is a correct argument here to say that actually our intake of glucose is important because we know it partly controls the release of this VLDL and therefore the Apo B. There's lots of other factors that are involved, but I will give that glucose is important from that point of view. What happens then is these particles circulate in our blood with this Apo B attached to it. And these particles tend to be rich in triglycerides, and they also have cholesterol. As they circulate, the triglycerides are slowly removed from these particles, and you end up with these very small containing Apo B particles. Most of these become LDL particles, which we call our bad cholesterol. So these LDL particles basically have an Apo B attached to them, and they have hardly any triglyceride left in them, and they've just got cholesterol. So they're like a cholesterol particle. But you do have Apo B particles that are still those big chylomicrons or VLDL that have only just come from the liver and come from the gastrointestinal tract. We know the large ones are less harmful, but we know that they still play a role in atherosclerosis. We know that the small ones are particularly harmful because they can pass into the lining of the blood vessel walls, and then they can cause this furring of the arteries. we know this from mechanistic studies, we know this from human studies, we know from randomized controlled trials that if you make certain dietary changes, that you can increase or decrease your circulating levels of apolipoprotein B. It's a good surrogate for LDL cholesterol. So it's very much correlates with LDL cholesterol, but it tells us also about some of these other particles that are circulating. And so it's a slightly more accurate measure of what we call atherogenic lipoprotein. So it's a slightly more accurate measure of what parcels, in simple terms, are circulating that we know might be pro-atherogenic, might be pro-furring of the arteries. There is consistent evidence that people who have higher apolipoprotein B, or LDL cholesterol, but higher apolipoprotein B, have higher rates of cardiovascular disease, have greater atherosclerosis. So this comes from all sorts of studies looking at increasing Apo B, looking at, you can do certain measures to look at the functioning of the blood vessels, to look at how the endothelium, that lining of the blood vessels, work. We know that if you reduce your Apo B, you can reduce your levels of cardiovascular disease risk, reduce your levels of atherosclerosis. I don't know, I must say, I've stopped looking at some of the evidence that people use to say, oh, it's all nonsense, etc., around ApoB, because, yeah, I don't waste my time looking at that anymore. So I'm happy if there's some specific studies or specific points that people are saying. I'm really happy for you to ask, to present them and to see if I've got an answer to those.
Yeah. So, okay. So if we said, so if you got your bloods done, this happened to me actually last year. So, and I was actually probably like aesthetically and felt the best I've felt in all my life, fastest, strongest I'd ever been. And I got my bloods done and I had high LDL.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. And then that sort of sent me down this route of like looking at alternatives, views, because of course the NHS line is kind of like, well, you need to reduce that. And I'm like, okay. So, and I was probably quite high fat, quite low carb. And then I sort of like, over time, I think it just like wore me down a bit. And because if you're in that place, you want to be healthy. People want to do the best for their health, right?
Yeah.
So I sort of like, I towed like the mainstream line a bit. I reduced my saturated fat. I started sort of probably increasing my carbs as a result. And then actually I put on weight and felt less good. See, so in that situation, now I've actually not, because it's difficult to get an Apo B test at the moment, isn't it? So I can see why that's kind of not being pushed as well. So in that scenario, let's say I had a high LDL, but I went and got a private test that did Apo B, and they said your Apo B levels are fine. Would you say that was okay, or would it still be a cause for concern with the LDL?
So I think that would be quite unusual to have a fine ApoB and a high LDL. For every LDL particle, it has one ApoB attached to it. And so, yes, we do know that you can have different sizes of LDL. So you can have larger LDL that has more cholesterol in and only has one ApoB versus smaller LDL that has less cholesterol in it and more ApoB. We do know, based on current evidence, that ApoB is a more accurate measure relating cholesterol or lipids to cardiovascular disease risk. However, I still believe, based on the current evidence, that even if your ApoB is normal, if you've got elevated LDL, I believe that you should still be looking at how you can reduce that LDL. This is based on the current evidence. Our understanding around ApoB and different particles and particle sizing is still emerging. But I think that it would be, I believe that there would only be a small proportion of people, and actually we did study this in our own cohort where we looked at how many are discordant for ApoB versus LDL. So how many people have a high ApoB and a low LDL or vice versa. And we did actually see that there was, I can't remember the exact statistics. I think it was about 10% of people that fall into that. I can't remember what we did next with that. We've done so much analysis, but it was interesting. We did see that there was some discordance. The thing is to see is, yes, how does that play out in terms of health outcomes? But I think for anyone who's still got high LDL, I would suggest that they still need to reduce their LDL cholesterol. I mean, I think, Jason, the story that you paint where you increased your carbohydrates, you reduce your fat, you put on weight, you felt less healthy. One thing to say about that is that we are all so different. So going back to what I said at the beginning, what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for the other. And there's a great study done by one of my colleagues, Christopher Gardner, called Diet Fit. And this is a study where he randomly allocated people to either follow a low carb, high fat diet or a low fat, high carb diet. And what he found was that everyone on average lost some weight, and the primary outcome was weight. But what he found was that on each diet, there was massive variability. So some people switching to the high carb diet had huge reductions in weight and some had huge increases. Likewise, some switching to a high fat diet, some it caused a huge increase in weight, others it caused a huge reduction. Just showing that this kind of idea of one size fits all, isn't necessarily right for everyone. And again, I think it brings home the message of being really careful about when you're following people on social media. I think that just because it's worked for that person doesn't mean it's necessarily going to work for you. And so it might be that for you, it's better to follow a high fat diet. And I actually think the evidence around following a moderately high fat diet, as long as it's from healthy sources containing lots of mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids, I think that's can be a very healthy diet as long as you're having adequate fiber. I think that if you're switching to a higher carb diet and the carb is coming from more refined grains, your white bread, white rice, white pasta, for example, that's not going to be good for you. And so for me, I think it's very much not worrying so much about the nutrient. Is it carb or is it fat? It's thinking about what's the quality of the food it's coming from, the quality of the nutrient.
Yeah, thank you for that. Wonderful explanation. And because I've mentioned this to a GP before. I've mentioned Apo B, and they look at me like.
It's common in the US. A lot of people can get it measured in the US now. It's becoming more routine in the States. In the UK, not yet, but that's because it's a lot more expensive to measure and you actually need specialist lab equipment to measure it. You can't just do it using the very routine clinical chemistry that's done in most hospitals. So that's why it's not routinely done in the UK. I mean, it is for our research studies. It's what we measure for any diet study. We measure Apo B, and we measure there's different types of Apo B. We also look at the different types of Apo B as well.
Yeah, it makes sense because they've got to deliver healthcare en masse, haven't they? I mean, when I told them I'd had a blood panel done, they were like, "What? Is there anything wrong with you?" I was like, "No," and then they looked at me like, I was like, "Yeah, here's my spreadsheet." But yeah. Anyways, I wanted to ask you, slightly relating to what we were just talking about, calories in, calories out. I had a little bit of a discussion with someone over Instagram regarding this because I've been on a little bit of a journey myself just recently, trying to reduce a little bit of bloat, tracking my calories. I've never done that before.
Yeah.
And I was kind of looking at patterns and measuring the circumference of my stomach, and then going like, okay, what's going on here? Like, what? There was this increase here, despite basically my calories being the same. The one thing I tracked it to was instead of taking frequent walks throughout the day, I think I took one walk, largish walk, rather than lots of little ones. And I also had it's probably a different thing, but I also had some wheat, and I don't think in general I respond to wheat very well. And he was saying to me, calories in versus calories out. There's this study. None of it matters. So I wanted to put that to you because I was kind of the belief that you can leverage things like meal timing, glucose regulation, a walk after a meal, that kind of thing. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two questions within that. There's the question of, does calorie restriction, i.e., changing your calories, actually equal weight loss? And then there's the other question of, how important, or how important is calorie restriction versus all of these other factors? So I think the first question that people always say is, does calorie restriction work? So does reducing your calorie intake result in meaningful and sustained weight loss? We know that restricting your calorie intake can result in weight loss. We know that restricting your calorie intake is unlikely to result in sustained weight loss, that people rebound. And there's been loads of trials that show this, that yes, going on a calorie restricted diet, you'll reduce your weight, but in the long term, people put it back on. And that's because our bodies are so clever and have evolved to handle calorie restriction, to handle famine. Our bodies and our biology has not caught up with this obesogenic food environment that we live in, where we have an excess of calories for the majority of us around us. And so what happens is when we start to restrict our calories, our body goes into, whoa, famine mode. I need to safeguard what energy I have. And so firstly, the hunger signals in your brain change. So your hunger signals become heightened. So what that means is that something that might have kept you full before no longer keeps you as full, because your brain is tricking you into thinking, you've got to give me more calories because I've got to have more calories in order to build back that calorie loss. The other things that happens is our metabolic rate changes. It doesn't change by a huge amount. It changes by less than what we used to think 10, 20 years ago, but it does change. So your resting metabolic rate reduces a little bit, so that just even when you're sitting or lying in bed, you're using less calories, because again, your body's going into famine kind of preservation mode. Now, you can fight against these hunger signals, and you can fight against the fact that you need to eat even less because your metabolic rate's going down for a certain period of time. But there's only so long that most people can kind of fight against your body's natural drive to eat more food. And that's why a lot of diets fail, because people try and lose weight too quickly. They have these compensatory mechanisms. Then they go on to, eat the food or more food and put the weight back on. That's one argument for why a calorie restricted approach doesn't work. Then there's the area around, actually, there's loads of other things that we can be doing instead of conscious calorie restriction that I believe would be more effective. So, for example, we know that if you practice time restricted eating, so this is where you eat within a certain window, and it doesn't have to be an excessive window. So where you might have your last meal at 8 in the evening and maybe not have breakfast till 10 the next morning. So that means that you're fasting for a period. Oh, I can't work it out. That's 14 hours. Is that you're not eating?
What was it? 8 till 8? What did you say? 8 till
10.
8 till 10? Yeah, so that'd be 14:10, wouldn't it? Yeah. I'm familiar with
And
16:8 was the one that I most regularly sort of do. Oh,
yes, there's all
which is 8
different
till 10,
ones
12, yeah.
ones that you can do. But what we know is that if people restrict their eating window, and again, you don't have to do it excessively. So let's say you eat within a 10-hour window. So you're having your breakfast at 10 in the morning, you're having your last meal at 8 in the evening. So, that's still quite, I think, doable. Or your breakfast at 9, your last meal at 7. Just by reducing the window in which you're eating, i.e. not late night snacking, not eating your meals late or excessively early, we know that without even thinking about it, if you tell someone, just reduce your eating window, without even thinking about it, people on average reduce their calorie intake by 300 calories. So there's things like that that we can do that are likely to result in more sustained weight loss, because you're not doing it in this conscious way where you're still hungry. Your hunger signals are less heightened. There's other tricks as well. So things like eating rate. We know that the speed in which you eat impacts your hunger. So there's some really good evidence showing if you can just slow down how quickly you eat your meals by 20%. So that means, for example, eating your lunch, instead of in 10 minutes, eat it in 12 minutes. Then actually that will reduce your energy intake, again, without thinking about it, by 15%. So I think there's lots of ways we can change how we're eating rather than focusing on back of pack labeling. And then I think the last really important point to make around calories is that not all calories are equal, and not all calories estimates are accurate. So by not all calories are equal, I mean some foods and some nutrients are more filling than other foods. We know that per calorie, protein and fat is more filling, for example, than carbohydrates. We know that refined carbohydrates in particular don't fill us up for very long. They often cause us to have a glucose dip. That glucose dip, we know from our own research, drives you to eat more food sooner, and more calories. But we also know that actually the back of pack labeling isn't always that accurate. And so I've done some research looking at the amount of calories that are absorbed from almonds versus kind of processed almonds where they've been ground. And what we know is if you take a whole almond, and most people think of almonds or any nuts as being high calorie, high fat, because they are high calorie, they are high fat. However, if you eat a whole almond, because of this magical food matrix, this structure of the almonds where the cell walls are very rigid and the cell walls are very resistant to breakdown in the gut, what happens is about 30% of the energy is actually excreted. So actually the back of pack labeling that shows that a portion of almonds contains 170 calories is wrong. Actually, on average, we only absorb about 125 of those calories. If you finely grind the almonds, like to make a marzipan, or finely grind them for, a commercial nut butter, then actually it breaks all of the cells. Remember, these cells are only the size of like a grain of sand. So your teeth can't break them, but a commercial process could break them. So then the cell walls are broken. All of the fat that's contained within the cell walls is released, and they are 100% digestible. So you absorb all of the energy. So from the ground almonds, you'll absorb 170 calories per portion. From the whole almonds, on average, you'll only absorb about 125 calories per portion. And yet the back of pack labeling would show that they're identical. So that's the other thing we need to be aware of, is that for some foods, not all foods, there are some limitations in the back of pack labeling. Now, that's not going to apply to your average sandwich that you might get, at Pret or your supermarket for your lunch. They're going to be reasonably accurate. But for some plant-based foods, we know that the back of pack labeling for the calorie content is quite inaccurate as well.
And is that relating to, is that different to the thermogenic effect of food?
So the thermogenic effect of food is kind of simply put, and this isn't my area of research, so I will
Apologies.
I will put it quite simply. Any experts out there may wish to correct me on my use of terminologies, but very simply put, it's kind of the amount of energy that you use in order to eat that food. So it's the amount of heat that's released upon metabolizing that particular nutrient. And we know that the thermic energy of that's released by some nutrients is higher, for example, protein, than other nutrients, for example, carbohydrate. So that's a reason that people often say, well, actually, we're told that proteins have, 4 calories per gram, but actually some of that energy is used in actually breaking that protein down, in metabolizing that protein to use it for energy. So actually it's a lower amount of energy per gram than what is actually given to it.
Just another reason to eat protein.
Well, I think, the key thing that I think we need to do is get a balance. I think we need to eat a good amount of protein. I think that we need to make sure that we mix the different nutrients in our meal. So we don't want to just have protein and just have carbohydrate and just have fat. It's about getting a balance across all nutrients. There is a huge focus at the moment on protein, and I'm sure you're seeing this with people that you talk to. In the US, you go to a restaurant or one of those kind of lunch bars, and you'll get what salads do you want, what's potatoes, whatever do you want, and then there's the protein section, and they literally have it listed as protein, and then you get your choice of protein, whether it's a vegan style protein such as tofu or a meat protein such as chicken. And there is a hyper focus on protein. Most of us get enough protein. Most of us get more protein than we need. Not that there's any harm in getting up to a certain level of protein, but there's very few of us that are actually deficient in protein. But what we do know is that protein is great at making us feel full for longer. It's great at reducing our blood glucose response and increasing our insulin after having a meal. Certain types of protein are. And so it's a great addition to any meal.
Why is there this disparity then? I'm trying to think of, like I was listening to, she's called Dr. Gabrielle Leon. She was on Human Lab, and basically on this topic of protein is very important, and very much, you want to be getting it high as we get older, because our muscle mass decreases, so we need to increase the amount of protein to be able to have healthy muscle mass, which obviously helps as a glucose dump and stability and all the rest of it. Why is there this disagreement? Like, why can't people agree on things?
So I think, science isn't an exact science. And, I was brought up with always people using the term, it's an exact science, or it's not an exact science. Well, science isn't an exact science. Nutrition science, I think, is still in its relative infancy. That, yes, there has been nutrition scientists around for over 100 years. But actually, I think it's only more recently that we really are starting to understand the impact that food has on our health, the importance of different foods and the importance of different nutrients. But the problem is our food landscape is evolving at such a fast pace that our research can't always keep up with the pace at which our food landscape is evolving. So the kind of research I was doing on fats 15 years ago isn't so relevant to the kind of fats that are now commercially used now. Some of it is, some of it isn't, because, and so we can only move so fast as scientists, we can only move as fast as funding allows, etc., and our food landscape is changing loads. So whilst there is a lot we know, there's still a lot that we don't know as nutrition scientists. Where there's any areas of lack of knowledge or uncertainty, then that brings around this big difference in opinions. It brings up these areas that are very contentious and these polarized areas as well. Protein hasn't been as well researched as carbohydrates and as well researched as fat. So I think that's part of the problem. But I do think part of the problem is that there's still so much we don't know about the food that we eat and the nutrients that we eat. And that every food, like I said earlier, is so complicated. Every food contains, or most foods contain, a mixture of different proteins, and the mixture of different protein building blocks called amino acids might also interact with other elements of the food, etc. So we're still continually learning. We know that some proteins have a potent impact on insulin, for example, other proteins don't. So we've grouped proteins together as a whole, just like in the past we grouped fat together. We then understood 20, 30, 50 years ago that actually you can't just group fat. We have to separate it according to saturated, mono and polyunsaturated, and we need to even separate it further down. Maybe this is what we need to be doing with proteins, looking at the different amino acids. And I know that there's lots of great scientists out there doing it. It's not an area I'm well researched in by any means, but I know that there is ongoing research on this. I think you're right that it's a really important part of our diet. And yes, we do need to make sure we're getting enough protein. And yes, as we age, our protein needs increase. And yes, if we're more physically active and using our muscles more, yes, we need more protein. But on average, as a population, the majority of people get enough protein or get more than what's their kind of minimum requirements. So I think for most people, it's not a problem. Where it becomes a problem is people who are aging that aren't having enough energy intake and therefore aren't having enough protein naturally. It's just part of the food that they're eating. I think that we also are starting to understand the important role that protein plays in things like maintaining a stable blood glucose, in improving our fullness, reducing our hunger. So yes, it might be important from that point of view as well. But I think this view that we're protein deficient, we need to be adding, all of this protein to our diet, I don't agree with that, but I certainly think that, yes, we need to be getting a healthy amount of protein into our diet, and that increasing our protein is going to probably be beneficial for most people, but that it's not necessary. But that if we're choosing healthy sources of protein, it could have knock-on beneficial effects for us. But I think I would caution against people being what I call protein centric, where it's all about the protein, so they forget about the really important components of the diet, the fibre, the diversity of plant-based foods, healthy oils, etc.
I suppose like it's somewhat speculative, but I suppose the one thing I thought then when you were saying that most people aren't protein deficient, but also we have an obesity crisis, don't we? So I wonder if they're not protein deficient, but yet they're like smashing in like so many like so much pasta that they're going to be absorbing all the other stuff as well. So like with all of these, it's incredibly nuanced, isn't it? I don't believe there's any like cookie cutter answer. And I think it comes back to what you were saying originally, which is like Zoe's whole thing is individualized approaches, learning how you respond.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know as well that there's huge variability in how people absorb protein. So
Mm,
some people absorb it really well, some people absorb certain amino acids well, some people absorb other ones really well. I have a colleague, Dr. Ollie Whittard, who is a fantastic nutritionist. He's a sports nutritionist, but he specializes in protein as well. And he's done some fabulous studies looking at how some people absorb their protein really well, other people absorb it less well. So again, it goes back to that whole premise of exactly what we're doing at Zoe is taking an individualized approach, because what might be right for one person in terms of protein might not necessarily be right for the other person. It's difficult at a population level to take an individualized approach. And our ultimate goal at Zoe is that we will have enough evidence that we will be able to, at a population level, deliver individualized advice by using very simple measures or understanding very simple kind of characteristics to do with a person.
all right, so I know we need to wrap up soon, but I want to just run through some sort of highly tactful stuff that we can do. Now, if we look at Zoe is a more premium product. Last time I looked at, I know it's quite a lot of money for some people, and
Yeah.
so I was wondering if we had like a variety of budgets, let's say like £20, £100, and maximum per month to spend on something. And let's say most of the bases have covered. Maybe they've got a gym membership.
Yeah.
What things can they do? Can they pick up a continuous glucose monitor? What are some actionable stuff that we could invest in?
Okay, so first I'd invest in free stuff. So I would invest, if you have an interest in this area, in listening to podcasts. So we also have our own Zoe podcast. It's the Zoe Science Nutrition podcast. It's a weekly podcast. It's centered around some of the science at Zoe, but also having expert scientists in the area who come on each week, who talk about the science, but ultimately give us actionable advice around all sorts of dietary and lifestyle things that we can do and implement into our life that will improve our health. There are other good podcasts that are out there, but I think that the Zoe one is fantastic because of the actionable element to it. People can also follow us, Zoe, on our webpage, where again we have different blogs that come out, etc. All of this is free. So there's a lot of free resources, not just from Zoe, but there's lots of free resources that are out there also from other areas. I would caution about anyone buying a single metric device. So by that, I mean, I would caution anyone just going out and getting a continuous glucose monitor. Firstly, I would caution against anyone doing that without having a proper app or a healthcare practitioner or a nutritionist or dietitian to advise them on the results. But I would caution against it because it's just one piece of a huge piece of the puzzle that shapes how we respond to food and our health responses to food. And I think that, for example, if you got a CGM and didn't have proper advice, you could look at the CGM and you could say, oh my gosh, this food is causing a big peak in glucose, but, this lump of lard is not, so the lump of lard must be healthier. Well, I hope everyone listening knows that that's not the case. We don't want anyone consuming a big lump of lard. But if they weren't properly educated about the CGM, then they may make not that extreme silly decisions, but decisions that aren't best for their health. So I would caution against buying anything that doesn't have proper support, but also a single metric, because we know that it's not just our glucose that's important. There's so many other things that are really important for us. This is why it becomes difficult on a budget, therefore, unless you're measuring the many, many pieces of a puzzle to do it on a budget. I would also caution against people doing other single metrics like your microbiome, because your microbiome on its own, based on current evidence, is not sufficient to tell you what kind of foods you should be eating. Yes, combined with lots of other measurements, it can give you some help. But again, I would be cautious against any of these single measures. What I think that we need to be working on most is implementing changes that we know are sustainable. We know that less than 1% of people follow the core UK dietary guidelines. So I think it's about thinking about you as an individual, what you think you can implement that actually you can stick with, for more than a week, for more than a month, and thinking about what will make you stick with it. And that's where I would invest the money, on more that kind of behavioral side. So is it tracking would help you stick with it? Getting some sort of dietary tracking app, for example. I mean, there's lots that are actually free out there, but there's some that are very low cost. Or tracking some of your health metrics. So, some of the wearables that are out there, like the Apple Watches, the Whoop, the Oura Rings, those sorts of things, so that you can see what you're eating and how that's impacting your health. So investing in those kind of wearables, if you know that that's going to motivate you, that you're seeing you're sleeping better or your heart rate variability has come down. But I think in terms of individual products that are available at £20 or £100, there's none that jump to my mind that I would recommend. And this isn't because I think everyone should be spending hundreds and hundreds of pounds at Zoe. It's because I'm not aware of any single measures that I think are especially meaningful. But I think that certainly if tracking helps you, which we know it does for many people, improve your adherence to healthy diet and lifestyle, that's probably where I'd start by investing any money.
Thank you for that. And I'll link all that stuff in the show notes as well. Before we finish, I know that you're all on variety, so you'll probably hate me for this question. But if you had to live off, I'm going to give you 10 foods.
Yeah.
For
Oh,
you.
wow.
You've got 10. Yeah, it's not top 3. 10 foods to live off. You don't have to include like spices and stuff. I'll give you them.
Okay.
But like main foods, what are you throwing in there?
Do you know, I've done a lot of podcasts, but I've never been asked this question. This is a good one. I would say nuts. I would say nuts because they are packed with healthy oils. They're packed with great kind of bioactive polyphenols. They're packed with fiber, good proteins. And we know from our own research, if you add nuts to your diet, you can reduce cardiovascular risk factors by about 30%. If you add a healthy serving of nuts. So I would put nuts up there as the top. I would also put seeds, if I can count that as a separate category, for the same reasons as nuts. I'd probably put in some dairy. So I would either choose kefir or Greek yogurt, because we know it's packed with probiotic bacteria, which are really good for us.
And also, what about zero fat Greek yogurt?
Yeah, zero fat's
okay?
just as good. Zero fat, full fat's fine. There's a myth that full fat yogurt or full fat dairy increases cholesterol. If it's fermented dairy, i.e. yogurt or cheese, the evidence shows that at normal intakes, there's no impact of dairy fat on cholesterol because of this special food matrix. So either zero fat or full fat kefir or Greek yogurt, fine. Just choose whatever you prefer the taste of. Oh, we're up to 3. I would choose avocados. And I would choose avocados because they taste nice. They have fantastic heart healthy oils and they are packed full of fiber. So I choose those as well.
I love them. They don't love me.
Oh, okay.
Unless they're really ripe. I find this like bananas, avocados. Unless they're really ripe, they can kind of. But I do like them.
Yeah, I think that's because of the fibre if they're not so ripe.
Mm.
Um, okay, then I would add in some sort of whole grain to this.
Mhm.
Um, oh, and I don't know what whole grain. I'd add in a whole grain that I like. So I'd actually add in like a kind of whole grain bread because I do quite like a bit of whole grain bread
Mhm.
because we need a bit of carbohydrates in there. Then I would add in some pulses. I love chickpeas.
Mhm.
So, and they are a great source of protein, great source of fiber. I would also add in some chicken
Mhm.
because I think that chicken is a great source of protein. It doesn't have any of the, or it has very little of the kind of saturated fats that other red meats have that we know are unfavorable for our health. Okay, how are we getting on? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I've got
I've,
3 more. I'm
I love that
struggling
you've
now.
got a pen and paper, by the way.
I'm
Spoilt for choice.
Oh, do you know what I would add in? I would add in some chocolate because I love chocolate,
Mm.
and I do believe that if a diet's too healthy to be enjoyed, it's just not healthy at all. So
What
let's add in
um
something for pleasure.
what level of darkness are we talking? Are we just
So I don't like particularly dark chocolate. I
Mhm.
think that yes, there's good evidence to show that if it's above 70% cocoa, then it's going to be better for our health. But the key thing is to make sure it's not a really high sugar chocolate. I think that's equally as important as the amount of cocoa
Mm.
that's in the chocolate.
I've got a
Uh,
chocolate hack actually, if you're interested, that I made up. So what I'll do is you can buy like, is it like 95% or whatever? It's extremely bitter.
yeah.
So I'll buy a really strong one and then I'll buy one that's like 80. I'll have the strong one first
Oh, and
and
then
then it's really bitter. And then when I have the 80%, that tastes like dairy milk.
oh, okay,
So you kind of like yeah, you're kind of just setting your expectations slightly different. There you go.
great. And then I would add in a vegetable.
Mhm.
Um, so whatever vegetable anyone enjoys. I mean, ideally you need to go for variety, but given what else I put there, I'd probably add in uh, a vegetable like broccoli.
Yes. I eat
Uh,
so much broccoli.
Oh, and then something that I have forgotten, I would definitely add in extra virgin olive oil, and I'm at my 10 now.
Very nice. So no eggs, no fish. Interesting.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Okay, can I have 12? I'm going to be greedy, having said I was struggling with that.
Go on then.
I would definitely add in eggs. I think that they are a totally underestimated powerhouse of nutrition. They are a fabulous part of a diet. Obviously, we don't want to have too many, but we do know that having a couple of eggs a day or up to 5 a week does not raise our cholesterol. Despite them having cholesterol in, we now know that we can eat eggs as part of a healthy diet. Um, and yeah, I mean, I do think oily fish, white fish is a really fantastic element of any diet as well.
Sarah, this has been wonderful. Thank you for doing this. This has been an absolute pleasure. Um, what's coming up in the future? I believe you've got a study underway.
We've got lots of exciting studies on the go at Zoe. We have this gold mine of data, and we're diving into all of that, looking at relationships between, different foods, microbiome, loads of different health outcomes. We're doing a lot on the menopause, looking at how diet might be related to menopause symptoms, how it can reduce menopause symptoms. I've also got a huge project going on at King's where we're looking at the relationship between both the microbiome and the food that we eat and early onset colorectal cancer, which we know is increasing, a lot in younger individuals. And so we're looking at how we might be able to personalize the diet to reduce early onset colorectal cancer. And yeah, we're continuing at Zoe to collect more data in order to understand more about people's individualized responses to food. And every month we've got new research coming out, and all of that can be found on our Zoe website. And it's exciting time for us all to be in nutrition research.
Wonderful. I shall look out for that. And if people want to catch up with you personally, what's your Instagram, all that stuff?
So I am Dr. Sarah Berry, Instagram, and I am also on Twitter, although I don't use Twitter so much. I'm Sarah E. Berry. But yeah, catch up with me on Instagram on Dr. Sarah Berry.
Okay, and I'll link all that in the show notes below. Thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you. It's been great. And Jason, not only do you have the same name as my brother, you ask the kind of questions that he would always ask me, which are the ones I'm least expecting. So,
Right. Oh, that's wonderful. Hey guys, it's me. Thank you so much for watching that episode, and congratulations for making it all the way to the end. I really appreciate it. A few things before you get going. If you haven't already, please do subscribe. And if you enjoyed this episode, the kindest thing you can do for me is to share it with a friend or family member. Don't forget to check out the show notes for links to both my guests and myself. And if you made it this far, why don't you drop me a DM?